March 30th, 2002. Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park. 3:15 in the afternoon. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was found dead in her bed at the age of 101, 7 weeks after her younger daughter, Princess Margaret, and almost exactly 50 years after her husband, King George VI. She had outlived him for half a century and spent every year of that widowhood becoming, by the measurable evidence of polling and public reception, the most consistently popular member of the British royal family. A 1990 MORI survey found that virtually every British respondent could identify her correctly. Not the Prime Minister, not the Archbishop of Canterbury, her. The image that most people carried of her was specific: a pastel coat, a wide-brimmed hat in a complementary shade, a smile that managed to look simultaneously warm and immovable, a wave developed across 7 decades of public appearances into something approaching an art form. She was Britain's national grandmother at a moment when the institution she represented desperately needed one. The 1990s had not been kind to the royal family. She was the one constant, still waving, still smiling, still there. She also died with approximately £4 million owed to Coutts & Co., the royal family's private bank. 4 days after her death, The Guardian ran a headline, "The Gamble That Foiled the Taxman." Within 6 weeks, a palace statement put the estate at approximately £50 million, with other assessments reaching as high as £70 million. Her art collection alone, including a Monet landscape bought in 1945 for £2,000, worth up to £15 million at auction by 2002, alongside works by Augustus John, L.S. Lowry, Graham Sutherland, Paul Nash, and some 30 others, was valued at approximately £35 million. Her jewelry added another £16 million. And in September 2024, when Prince Harry turned 40, he reportedly received approximately £8 million from a trust his great-grandmother had established 30 years earlier. So the question that has sat in comment sections and biographer footnotes for 22 years: how does a woman with a £4 million overdraft leave her great-grandchildren a fortune worth multiples of that figure? The answer is that the money was never in the same bucket to begin with. 3 instruments operating simultaneously produced the apparent paradox. Parliament provided a floor income that was structurally never adequate for what she actually spent. Her eldest daughter covered much of the difference, during her lifetime and comprehensively after it. And 8 years before she died, the Queen Mother placed roughly 2/3 of her liquid personal fortune into a trust that her personal creditors had no legal claim on whatsoever. Each arrangement was legal. Each was deliberate. Each produced a different financial reality that appeared, in isolation, incompatible with the others. Together, they add up. What follows is the evidence. Start with the will. Specifically, what isn't in it? On 9th April 2002, 10 days after the Queen Mother's death, Queen Elizabeth II applied to the High Court to have her mother's will sealed. The move, The Guardian reported, infuriated some Labour MPs. Under pressure in May 2002, the palace released a summary. Estate valued at approximately £50 million, primary beneficiary the Queen, certain items of the private art collection transferred to the royal collection for public display at the newly opening Queen's Gallery. Prince Charles would move across the road from St. James's Palace to Clarence House and would receive use of Birk Hall in Scotland. The full details of the will, specific bequests, exact valuations, complete list of beneficiaries beyond those headlines, remained sealed. They still are. The Cambridge Law Journal confirmed that both Princess Margaret's will and the Queen Mother's were sealed shortly after their deaths in 2002. The judicial rationale given in subsequent proceedings was that the degree of publicity that publication would attract would be wholly contrary to the aim of maintaining the dignity of the sovereign. That is worth dwelling on, not the sovereign's finances, the sovereign's dignity. The ceiling mechanism is explicitly designed to maintain separation between what the royal family's accounts actually show and what the public can require to be made visible. It's the structural reason the paradox has persisted for so long. Without full probate disclosure, the figures available to anyone assembling the picture come from contemporaneous journalism, investigative biography, and occasional official summaries, not from primary record. What the journalism of 2002 captured is largely what we still have. The Guardian's April and May reporting is the most useful contemporaneous source, and it's worth being precise about what it says and what it does not say. The estate, at £50 to £70 million, was clearly solvent against a Coutts overdraft of approximately £4 million. The mechanism by which Elizabeth II cleared it, inheriting the estate under a 1993 inheritance tax exemption that saved approximately £28 million, was confirmed. The precise figure of the overdraft at the exact moment of death, as distinct from the figure reported in the late 1990s, isn't in the public record. The £4 million figure cited in contemporary reporting is the most consistently documented, though some accounts suggest it may have grown further in the final years. What isn't in doubt is that the debt existed, that it was real, and that the estate that covered it was large enough to do so without difficulty. Now to how the debt accumulated in the first place. The civil list was Parliament's annual grant to fund the official duties of the monarch and a small number of senior royals, staff costs, engagements, ceremonial functions, the maintenance of official households. From 1st January 1991, the Queen Mother's civil list allowance was set at £643,000 per year, raised from £334,400 by the Civil List, Increase of Financial Provision Order, 1990. That figure was confirmed by primary legislation and remained unchanged until the Civil List was abolished by the Sovereign Grant Act, 2011. Only 3 members of the royal family ever received direct Civil List payments: the Queen, Prince Philip, and the Queen Mother. Charles and the other senior royals were funded through separate mechanisms, or had their civil list payments reimbursed to Parliament by the Queen. The Queen Mother and the Duke of Edinburgh were specifically exempt from the 1992 reforms, under which the Queen agreed to pay income tax from April 1993. As the official record confirmed, they remained the only members of the royal family other than the Queen in receipt of money from public funds which isn't repaid. In July 2000, Tony Blair made a statement to the House of Commons confirming the overall civil list would remain fixed at £7.9 million annually for the coming decade, the same figure as 1990. Accumulated surpluses from the Queen's household, driven by lower-than-expected inflation, had built up a £35 million reserve. None of this applied directly to the Queen Mother's £643,000 portion, which operated as a fixed allocation within the broader framework. No specific parliamentary challenge to her allowance is recorded in the available Hansard debates. £643,000 annually. That was the floor. Her actual household costs. Running Clarence House with a permanent staff of more than 40 people, 27 of whom reportedly lived rent-free in grace and favor accommodation, maintaining several further residences across England and Scotland, sustaining a program of public engagements, ran to somewhere between £1.5 million and £2 million per year. The civil list covered less than half. The gap between what Parliament provided and what she actually spent was, year on year, somewhere between £860,000 and £1.36 million. Compounded over a decade, that gap is the Coutts overdraft. Alan Hamilton, writing in the Times in July 1999, as the Queen Mother approached her 99th birthday, was precise about the implication. Few would begrudge the nation's senior great-grandmother her long and lavish retirement, he wrote, cushioned by a state pension of £643,000 a year. But then few, including her own daughter and her daughter's hard-nosed moneymen, would dare. He noted the small matter of the £4 million overdraft, which hasn't been denied and which, it has been hinted, may even be an understatement. At Clarence House, he wrote, "No draught of frugality stirs the curtains." The man formally responsible for managing the finances was Major Sir Ralph Anstruther, who served as the Queen Mother's treasurer from 1961 until he stepped down in 1998. Across nearly 4 decades, while inflation changed the purchasing power of the civil list, while household costs accumulated, while the overdraft grew, Anstruther had, according to the Telegraph's 2024 assessment of the Queen Mother's financial history, only a vague grasp of her spending. For 37 years, the financial officer of one of the most prominent households in Britain apparently didn't have a working command of what that household was spending. Coutts, for its part, never called in the debt. A bank whose client base is built on hereditary wealth and royal association does not pursue the monarch's mother through enforcement proceedings. The overdraft was extended, maintained, and allowed to grow, with the tacit understanding that the institution it represented was sufficient security. The Queen apparently acknowledged all of this with the particular dry wit available to people who have concluded that nothing is going to happen. According to The Guardian's contemporaneous reporting in March 2002, she was known to remark that Coutts would have folded long ago but for Mummy's overdraft. What the civil list paid for was the official minimum. What actually sustained the Queen Mother's life was something else entirely. The art collection, accumulated over 60 years of patient and sometimes inspired purchasing, was by 2002 an extraordinary asset, but an illiquid one. She wasn't selling Monets to cover quarterly payroll. The Monet landscape, Study of Rocks, Cruz Fresseline, painted in 1889, bought at an auction in 1945 for £2,000, worth anything up to £15 million at the time of her death, was sitting on a wall, not in a bank account. The wider collection, which included works by Augustus John, Edward Seago, Paul Nash, John Piper, L.S. Lowry, Millet, Sisley, and others, brought the total painting value to approximately £35 million, according to Guardian estimates. Her jewelry, a diamond necklace that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, a sapphire brooch she had given to Princess Diana on her wedding day, a Greville festoon necklace assembled by Cartier in 5 rows, added another £16 million. Fabergé eggs, porcelain, silver, furniture. The full material estate was, by any calculation, substantial. Wealth in art and jewelry does not pay staff wages. The residences were multiple. Clarence House in London, her main base from 1953 onwards. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, the home her husband had renovated in the 1930s. Birkhall on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, and the Castle of May in Caithness, at the extreme north of Scotland near John O'Groats, the one property she actually owned outright, rather than occupied on Crown terms, bought derelict in 1952 from money George VI had left her, restored slowly across decades. Most of her residences were Crown-owned, which meant the fabric of the buildings was someone else's problem. The staffing, heating, entertaining, and day-to-day running costs were hers. The 1,800-acre Castle of May estate alone cost at least £500,000 a year to maintain. The racing was a separate undertaking. She was a devoted patron of national hunt steeplechasing, jump racing, the winter and spring discipline, colder and harder than flat racing. The costs of keeping and training racehorses run to tens of thousands of pounds per animal per year, and she was an active owner for decades. The Guardian described it among her most significant ongoing expenses. She reportedly told a fellow dinner party guest, with the candor people occasionally apply to situations they find darkly amusing, "Golly, I could do with 100,000 pounds, couldn't you? Had such an awful afternoon today with my bank manager scolding me about my overdraft." On the other side of the ledger, The Guardian's April 2002 coverage was specific. It said that the Queen chipped in £2 million a year to keep her in the style to which she had become accustomed, and the Prince of Wales paid £80,000 a year to bump up the appallingly low wages paid to some of her aged retainers. The staff of more than 40 included individuals who had been in royal service for decades, on salary scales that hadn't kept pace with the broader labor market. Charles was supplementing their wages. Elizabeth was subsidizing the rest of the household. Neither contribution appeared anywhere in the civil list figures or the formal estate records. She lived to 101. That fact sits in the record, and it's its own kind of counter-argument. The lifestyle clearly wasn't shortening her life. But longevity doesn't resolve the financial structure. The spending was real, the gap was real, and the overdraft that resulted was real. Which brings us to the trust, and the mechanism that explains how the bequest outlasted the debt. In 1994, the Queen Mother was 94 years old. She placed approximately £19 million, roughly two-thirds of her personal liquid fortune, into a trust for her great-grandchildren. The number to hold on to is 1994, 8 years before her death. Under British tax law, assets transferred out of an individual's estate more than 7 years before their death generally fall outside the scope of inheritance tax. The standard rate is 40% on anything above the threshold. On £19 million, that would have been approximately £7.5 million in death duties. By establishing the trust in 1994, the Queen Mother was making a calculated gamble on her own longevity. She needed to live until 2001 for the assets to be fully clear. She died in March 2002. She had cleared the 7-year threshold by a year. The Guardian's April 2002 headline was unsparing: "The Gamble That Foiled the Taxman." The trust was established, the paper wrote, as a gamble at the age of 94 that she would live for another 7 years and so avoid paying 40%. That hurdle was cleared last year. Whatever else was true about the Queen Mother's financial life, whoever had advised her on this particular decision had done so with considerable precision. 2 years later, in 1996, the Castle of May was transferred to a charitable trust as well, removing the one property she actually owned from her personal estate entirely. But the inheritance tax angle, while significant, is the secondary story here. A trust, once properly established, is a separate legal entity. The assets inside it belong to the trust, not to the person who created it. When the Queen Mother transferred approximately £19 million into the trust in 1994, those assets legally left her personal ownership at that moment. They weren't available to pay her debts. They weren't subject to any claims her creditors could make against her personal estate when she died. The overdraft at Coutts was a personal liability. The trust assets weren't personal property. Coutts had no claim on the trust. The beneficiaries had no obligation to use their distributions to settle an overdraft they had never incurred. The trust and the debt existed in entirely separate legal compartments. They were never required to be reconciled. The Guardian's 2002 reporting estimated that William and Harry were likely to share approximately £6 million at age 21, with the larger share going to Harry. apparently as some compensation for not being in the direct line of succession, and a further £8 million when they reached 40. Those were the 2002 estimates, based on the trust's value at the time of her death. Assets in trust grow over decades. In September 2024, 30 years after the trust was established, Prince Harry turned 40. Multiple outlets, including Vanity Fair and the Seattle Times, reported that he received approximately £8 million from the trust, equivalent to roughly $10.5 million US. William, with access to the Duchy of Cornwall valued at well over £1 billion, received a smaller portion, reportedly by design. The trust was said to favor the Duke of Sussex precisely because he wouldn't inherit the same institutional financial infrastructure as his brother. A woman with a £4 million overdraft had placed assets worth multiples of that sum into a vehicle her creditors couldn't touch, 8 years before she died. That vehicle paid out over subsequent decades, growing as assets grow under proper management, arriving in Harry's account in 2024 from a woman who had been dead for 22 years. The title of this video says she left £10 million. The most specific confirmed figure is the approximately £8 million Harry received on his 40th birthday. Some outlets converted that to $10.5 million US. The trust for all great-grandchildren combined was valued much higher. What isn't in dispute is that the trust existed, was established with deliberate timing, and has made real payments to real people decades after the overdraft was closed. Now to the daughter, and to the transaction that cleared the debt. Queen Elizabeth II inherited her mother's estate when the Queen Mother died on March 30, 2002, under the terms of an arrangement negotiated with John Major's Conservative government in 1993, reached at the same time the Queen agreed to pay income tax for the first time. Property passing between a consort's estate and the current monarch was exempt from inheritance tax. The Guardian was explicit. The Queen won't have to pay inheritance tax on her mother's estate, valued at between £50 million and £70 million, thanks to a deal reached with John Major's government 9 years ago when she agreed to pay tax for the first time. On an estate valued at £70 million, standard inheritance tax at 40% would have represented approximately £28 million. The 1993 arrangement saved the Crown exactly that. The deal was framed publicly as necessary to preserve the sovereign's financial independence and to compensate her for not being able to earn her own living. For ordinary members of the public, the paper noted, the tax applies at 40% once an estate exceeds £250,000. The Queen inherited everything. The personal estate, the art collection, the jewelry, the liquid assets that hadn't gone into the 1994 trust passed to her without tax. The Coutts overdraft, as a personal liability of the estate, was settled from those inherited funds. An estate worth between £50 million and £70 million, inheriting a debt of approximately £4 million, produces a net position of approximately £46 to £66 million for the beneficiary. The £28 million tax saving alone was 7 times the overdraft. The post-death settlement is confirmed. What is separately reported, and carries its own weight, though without the same level of primary documentation, is the extent to which Elizabeth had been supporting her mother during her lifetime. The Guardian's April 2002 coverage cited the £2 million annual figure specifically, describing it as what the Queen chipped in to maintain her mother's household. Alan Hamilton in The Times in 1999 was less precise but unmistakable, writing that, "Goodness knows how many times her daughter has had to send round a postal order to cover an unpaid bill." No biographer has published a signed ledger showing specific monthly transactions. The specific funding mechanism, whether Elizabeth made payments directly to Coutts, transferred household funds, or covered specific bills as they arose, isn't confirmed with named primary source attribution. What is confirmed is the structural outcome. The estate passed to the Queen, the debt was absorbed and cleared, and the 1993 tax arrangement ensured the transfer left as much of the estate intact as legally possible. The will, which would tell the precise story in full, is sealed. Its specific bequests remain inaccessible to the public. The Cambridge Law Journal confirmed in 2002 that both Princess Margaret's and the Queen Mother's wills were sealed in the same year. A judge subsequently justified the practice on the grounds that publication would attract publicity wholly contrary to the aim of maintaining the dignity of the sovereign. The legal mechanism worked. For anyone relying on public record, the complete financial picture has never existed in a single accessible document. What leaked into the record came from contemporaneous journalism. The £4 million overdraft, the civil list shortfall, the £2 million annual contribution. These came from reporters working shortly after the death, not from probate filings. That is why the question of how the numbers add up has persisted in comment sections for more than 2 decades. The numbers do add up. They just never appeared in the same document. Before leaving the finances, there is something worth knowing about the specific personal rivalry that ran beneath the public image for more than 60 years. When Wallace Warfield Spencer Simpson's relationship with Edward VIII caused the abdication crisis of December 1936, it was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's husband, Albert, who was forced unwillingly onto the throne. Elizabeth became queen consort. The abdication was, for her, never a neutral event. In private, her vocabulary for the Duchess of Windsor was invariable. That woman. She never varied the phrase. Wallace returned the sentiment with considerably more creativity. According to documented biographical sources, Wallace referred to Elizabeth as Cookie because of her supposed resemblance to a fat Scots cook. The nickname circulated in the Windsor exile circle, the small world of displaced royalty and gathered sympathizers that surrounded the Duke and Duchess of Windsor as they moved between France and the Bahamas, entertaining visitors and nursing the grievances of the abdication. To call the Queen Consort, the woman now occupying the position at the center of British royal life, wife to the king Wallace had wanted to stand beside, a fat cook, was a pointed insult. It mocked her physical appearance. It placed her, by implication, below stairs in a social hierarchy that Britain in the 1930s and 1940s took very seriously indeed. There are more elaborate readings of what the nickname implied, circulating in biographical literature. The cook's household, the question of domestic origins, but the core of it's available in the simple version. Wallace Simpson thought Elizabeth looked like a servant, and said so in company. The Duke of Grafton later told biographers what the Queen Mother's own response to all of this had been. She had, he said, never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. That isn't quite magnanimity. It's the particular form of contempt available to someone who has already won, and knows it, and chooses not to celebrate. What the Cookie nickname does, beyond its historical interest, is close a certain distance. The woman on the balcony? The national grandmother, the one constant in the institutional storms of the 1990s. That woman was simultaneously being called Cookie in the circles of the Windsor exile court. Behind the pastel hat and the immovable smile was a person operating inside a very specific world of private enmity, contested loyalty, and personal history stretching back to a constitutional crisis in 1936. The warm public image existed alongside, and partly in deliberate response to, that private world. She gave no interviews. She responded to nothing publicly. She simply kept waving. The public image itself deserves brief examination, because it wasn't an accident. The foundation was genuine. She did refuse to leave London during the Blitz. She did visit bombed communities in the East End, visits that were initially met, the Wikipedia record notes, with hostility and thrown rubbish from people who resented expensive clothes during wartime, before she adjusted her wardrobe to gentle colors that Norman Hartnell called the rainbow of hope. She declared, when advised to send her daughters to Canada, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." She said it, and she meant it, and she stayed. Adolf Hitler reportedly described her as the most dangerous woman in Europe for the effect her wartime conduct had on public morale. That was the foundation. What was built on it, over the subsequent 50 years, was more carefully managed. By the 1980s and 1990s, academic analysis of royal public image had identified a specific role, what one study called the national grandmother archetype, that the Queen Mother occupied with evident expertise. Hundreds of public appearances, the distinctive wardrobe palette, the wave, the accessible manner deployed at precisely calibrated moments. The walkabout itself, now a standard royal engagement technique, was partly her innovation, developed during her years as Duchess of York before the abdication. She introduced a revolutionary informality into royal appearances, as Alan Hamilton wrote in the Times, inventing the walkabout and talking to people in the crowd as though she had known them all their lives. One published history of the period noted that the deaths of Princess Margaret and then the Queen Mother in 2002, and the funerals that followed, were regarded by many as a triumph for royal image makers. Both deaths had occurred in a period when the monarchy was still recovering from the reception of Diana's death in 1997. The management of public grief and public tribute around both women was handled with the full institutional apparatus available. The image management and the financial architecture ran in parallel. Both required that certain things not be assembled into a single legible picture at the same time. The finances were managed through instruments: trust law, a sealed will, a bank's professional discretion, a tax arrangement negotiated with a government that kept the components separate. The image was managed through decades of appearance calibration that kept the private reality at the appropriate distance from the public one. Together, they produced a woman who was, to the public, a grandmother made of warmth and duty and postage stamps, and was, to her own bank manager, a client who'd been running an overdraft for years that neither party was in a hurry to resolve. The resolution is in the accounting. Parliament provided £643,000 per year. The household spent between £1.5 million and £2 million. The difference, year after year, went on to the Coutts overdraft that neither Anstruther nor Coutts made any serious effort to reduce. In 1994, 2/3 of her liquid personal fortune, approximately £19 million, was moved into a trust that her creditors had no access to. Time to clear the 7-year inheritance tax threshold with room to spare. In 1996, the Castle of May went into a charitable trust. Her daughter reportedly contributed approximately £2 million annually toward household costs not covered by the civil list. When she died in 2002, Elizabeth II inherited the remainder of the personal estate under the 1993 inheritance tax exemption, saving approximately £28 million, and settled the Coutts overdraft from those inherited funds. At every point, the arrangements were legal. At every point, they were deliberate. The 1993 tax deal was negotiated in exchange for the Queen paying income tax for the first time. The 1994 trust was established with precision, at exactly the age when a 94-year-old with obvious clarity of mind might calculate whether she was likely to clear a 7-year threshold. The Castle of May transfer followed 2 years later. Anne Struthers' vague grasp of the spending wasn't a failure of the system. It was a feature of it. As long as no one was pressing for an audit, and Coutts wasn't calling in the debt, there was no mechanism that required the gap between income and expenditure to be formally closed. When Alan Hamilton wrote in The Times in July 1999, "Don't be fooled by sweet old ladies who smile on the world with grandmotherly indulgence and pretend that they are harmless old codgers, for they aren't always what they seem." He was writing about the overdraft. He was also, whether he meant to or not, describing someone who had spent 94 years watching how wealth and inheritance and institutional finance worked at the highest levels of British society, and who had acted on that understanding with considerable precision. She was, in Hamilton's phrase, a consummate professional. The finances were part of the same expertise as the wave. The confirmed numbers: estate between £50 million and £70 million. Civil list income £643,000 annually from 1991. Annual household expenditure between £1.5 million and £2 million. Trust established 1994. Principal approximately £19 million. 7-year inheritance tax threshold cleared, 2001. Death, March 30th, 2002. Age, 101. Inheritance tax exemption negotiated 1993, saving approximately £28 million. Harry's trust distribution at age 40, September 2024, approximately £8 million. Will. Sealed. The numbers we can't confirm from primary record. The exact overdraft figure at the moment of death, as distinct from the figure reported in the late 1990s. The precise mechanism and schedule of Elizabeth's reported lifetime contributions. The full list of trust beneficiaries and their individual distributions. The pattern those confirmed numbers form is unambiguous enough. The Queen Mother wasn't an irresponsible spender who accidentally left debt behind while somehow also leaving a fortune to her great-grandchildren. She was a person operating inside a specific financial architecture that was built, over decades, to produce exactly that result. Parliamentary income that underfunded the actual household. A family that covered the gap. A trust that moved the liquid assets beyond creditors' reach before the debt peaked. A tax arrangement that ensured the estate, when it passed clean and largely whole. That architecture isn't available to most people. Not the parliamentary income. Not the royal bank that extends unlimited credit. Not the sovereign-to-sovereign tax exemption. Not access to legal and financial advice that produces a trust timed to the 7-year threshold at the age of 94. Or a government willing to negotiate a tailored inheritance arrangement in exchange for a modest concession on income tax. The individual instruments, trusts, estate planning, family support, are available in principle to anyone. The combination, assembled over a century with the full institutional backing of the Crown, isn't. One final image as a way out. The Castle of May, the derelict pile on the far north coast of Scotland that she bought in 1952 with money her husband had left her, that she restored slowly across 4 decades, that she visited each August for her annual stay in Caithness, that she transferred to a charitable trust in 1996. After 1996, she paid rent to stay in a house she had spent 40 years building into something worth having. She was technically a tenant in the property she had made. From one angle, that looks like estate planning. From another, It looks like a woman ensuring that the thing she had created would outlast her in a form that someone couldn't sell to settle a bank debt. The Castle of May Trust is still operating, still maintaining the property, still opening it to visitors. What she built continues. Whether that final arrangement was an act of love for a place she had rescued from dereliction, or a last example of the same financial and institutional management that ran through her entire life, or both simultaneously. That question doesn't have a clean answer. The numbers add up. They just never added up in the same column. What do you remember about how the Queen Mother was presented where you grew up? Not only in Britain, in Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, in the communities around the world that had their own relationship with the image she projected? The picture looked different depending on where you were standing. If you have that memory and want to add it to the record, the comments are the place. Subscribe if you'd like more stories like this one.